Android specifically, in case of Android, you have many ways of handling the events from a user. More than one way of intercepting the events from a user's interaction and then responding to them. Now, this is done by providing what are called as public callback methods to handle UI events. There are ready-made methods that are available for you, and then you need to declare those methods within your activities in order to handle it. And these will be called by the Android framework when the respective action occurs. Say, for example, you include a button on the screen. If you include a button on your user interface screen, you need to immediately put in a handler inside your activity. Remember, every screen is controlled by an activity. So inside the activity, you need to specify this button. If this kind of event is generated by this button, this is the handler that is going to handle this. If you do not declare that, then whatever you do on the button, nothing is going to happen. Okay? So, in case you write an application and then you suddenly realize that even though you're pressing the button, nothing is happening, the first place to check is, did I declare a handler properly for my button or not? These are often things that I have seen people running to me to show. Somehow I have put this button on the UI, I click that, nothing is happening. And then they are frantic, they run to me and say, my program is not working. And then I say, did you put in a handler? And then I would realize that they would have forgotten to declare the handler somewhere. And then I have to remind them to go back, write the handler for it, and then you're done. So these are places that you need to watch out for. Okay? In case of Android, you have two kinds: event listeners and event handlers. Now, these are for generic things that I will talk about in a minute, and event handlers are more elaborate things that if you need to handle more elaborate views and so on, then event handlers are better. What are event listeners? Event listeners is an interface in the view. It's not view class, that's view class. It's view class. Okay? Class has a different meaning. Yes. Okay, I didn't know if everybody was familiar with the usage term. It's more of a British term than American term. Class.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. Oh, you have a dictionary.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that will be a good thing that you guys should consider doing. Using the camera on your mobile phone as a way of, whenever you encounter something, you're reading a book or paper, you encounter a word there, and then you don't know the meaning of the word. Scan that word and then immediately pop up the dictionary. That would be a very good application. I'm sure they exist. I've been told that such applications exist, but why not do one more of your own? Okay, very good. See, how do you come up with ideas? What is bothering me? That generates an idea for them. Like that, I have come up with app ideas based on what I need. Okay, so that's one good example of how you can come up with ideas. Okay, so this event listeners are called by the Android framework when the view to which the listener has been registered triggers it. As we saw, buttons, edit text boxes, and other things that you put on the screen. Whenever you touch them, the corresponding event listener has to be triggered. Within Android, it provides several different callback methods to handle different kinds of interactions with the user interface. Things like, for example, OnClick. When you click, if it is a physical button, you have to literally click the button. If it is a touch screen, you touch the screen, briefly touch the screen and lift your finger. That will be an OnClick. This is an on long click. So you see that if you just touch it and remove your finger, that's a different event as opposed to touching and holding it down for a period of time and then lifting your finger. Two different ways. Now I will also explain to you how you can make use of this and so on. On focus change, we'll talk about that in a minute. On key, on touch, and so on. I'll explain each one of them to tell you how you can make use of that. On click. Okay. Now, if you have a view, all of you know what a view is, right? From the previous discussion, a view is some widget that you put on the screen, that you make use of. Any view object that you put on the screen can have a corresponding listener attached to it. Okay. So on click, this particular method will be invoked if the user touches the item when in touch mode or focuses upon the item with the navigation key or trackball and presses the suitable enter key. If your device doesn't have a touch screen but instead has physical keys, then you can use the physical keys to navigate to select the item and then press. Like if you have some of the older phones, you have those four direction arrow keys there and then the center button there. That's one way of doing selection. No matter which way you do it, an on-click is an event that is generated. On long click, this is called when the user touches and holds the item, then in touch mode, or focuses upon the item and then holds the enter key for a period of time before releasing. Now, in your application, you can implement both of these for the same event, for the same view. You can implement both of these. Now the Android system will decide which one to call based upon your interaction. So suppose you implemented both on click and on long click for the same item, for the same button, for example. If you just touch the button and lift your finger, that will result in a call to the on click method. If you touch the button, hold it for a period of time and leave it, they will call this one. Okay? Now, if you do not implement this, now there is a hierarchy in the way things are invoked. If you do not implement on long click, but implement on click only for the item, so even a long click will be interpreted as a click. So that's one more way that you can. I will talk about that in a bit more detail. On focus change. This is one way. For example, if you're using the navigation key, you select an item and then you use the key to move away from the item. That is changing the focus of the item. That is one more place where you can respond to events. Now, why would you want to respond to an event like this for focus change? If the user is not using a touch screen but instead using a physical key to move, how would the user know whether they have selected a particular item or not? Now, normally what you would do is when the user is focusing on a particular item, you may want to change the color of that item to indicate to the user that the user has selected that item. The user is focused on that item. When the user moves away from that item, you want to change the color of that item. Now that recognition can be done by using this on focus change. Okay? For each of those views. If you don't implement it, no problem. This is just a one. You don't have to implement all these listeners for everyone. On key. This will be called when the user is focused on the item and presses and releases a particular key. You can have different keys being interpreted differently if you want. But if your system has only touch screen, then this is not an issue at all. If you have touch screen, you could even implement an on-touch listener. An on-touch listener will be invoked when you touch the item. Now you say, what's the difference between on-touch and on-click?
On-click.
Okay. Now on-click can work to handle things even if you don't have a touch screen. The on-touch will work only if you have a touch screen. Okay. So this is called when the user performs an act action qualified as a touch event, including the press, release, or any movement gesture of the screen. But this requires a touch screen support. Otherwise, the on-touch listener does not make sense. Okay. Again, there is one more called OnCreate context menu. This particular one will be invoked when the menu button in your device is clicked. The menu button. Now, with Android devices, they always have a menu button, or at least an on-screen menu button in there. Like, for example, this one has a menu button in here. The second one is a menu button here. So if I press that, that will invoke, that will issue a call to this one. I'll show you an example of how to handle that. In one of the lab exercises, we'll have an example of how you can create this and so on. The newer versions of Android has some other things also that can be used, things like context bar and so on, which I'll talk about later. But these are some things that are used in practice. Yeah?
Can you also kind of explain the difference of the OnKey and OnTouch stuff?
This is for physical keys.
Oh, you only for physical keys?
Physical keys.
And you
this is for touch.
And you also mentioned press and release. Do you mean that when you exactly press? Oh, you mean it's a you mean these two movements make one reaction?
One event.
Okay.
On key. Yeah.
Are there listeners for gestures, or do you have to use OnTouch and then write your own?
No. For gestures, there are separate listeners, or what are called as handlers. I will come to that in a minute. Handlers are a slightly different variety, a different animal altogether. We'll come to that in a minute. Let me show you an example of an event listener, just to give you an idea. Inside your Android's activity class, remember every activity has to be declared by extending the activity class. Okay, so that's what you're doing here. Public class example activity extends activity, and then you will specify that you are implementing a listener there. You can say implements OnClick listener, comma, on long click listener, comma, on key, and so on. So you can specify all the things. There are other ways of specifying also. Class declarations have two different ways of specifying these things. So you will see different examples using different methods of declaring these things. This is one such. Now, in this case, what we are doing is you have this OnCreate. Sorry, anybody? Question? Okay. What is this from the previous class? What is OnCreate? For an activity, what does OnCreate mean?
Just really
You answered a question in the quiz with some of those things in there. OnCreate, on resume, on start, on restart. What are those things? Those are all the methods that are invoked as your activity is passing through the different phases, right? We have seen them in the previous class. You saw the activity life cycle. These are the life cycle methods. So this is the life cycle method, OnCreate. Every activity has to have an OnCreate method. Without that, your activity will not work. In the OnCreate method, you would be identifying a button. Now, I am showing you real Java code. Okay? You will be identifying a button like this. Now, let me sort of briefly explain what this is. You will see an example of this kind of usage in the lab. Did you see it yesterday? You all had a lab yesterday, right? Some of you showed up there yesterday. You must have seen the use of these things. If you haven't, do the second lab and then you will understand. What does this mean? This is the way I identify a button inside the Android framework. So if I declare a button in my XML file corresponding to the layout, then that particular widget has to be identified. And then here I'm specifying that button is a widget, and this particular function call basically returns a handle to that button. This is Java. You all should know how to use Java, right? Or at least most of you should know. Well, it's not that difficult. This is a function call, and you are specifying something there. If you don't understand anything, just know that that's the syntax. Done. Okay? This is basically you're getting a pointer. If in C++ terms, you're like getting a pointer to that object. Okay? After that, you are specifying that you are declaring a listener for that. OnClick. You all know how to use this, right? This object. Okay. So you are specifying, saying that I am declaring an OnClick listener right here. So your system recognizes that there should be an OnClick listener declaration down below somewhere. So this is one way you can specify the OnClick listener. And in here, if you need to implement the OnClick listener, this is the method that you use. Public OnClick, and then it'll be given an argument with a view v. What this means is that you can use the same listener for listening, for providing handling capability for different views if you want, different objects on your screen if you want. 3 different buttons, you could use the same OnClick listener. And then inside here, you will use a switch statement in order to recognize which particular button was clicked. That's one way. You will have examples like that in the lab later. Okay. Now in here, you will be implementing the actual work. Okay. If you go into the lab exercise that you did or should have done yesterday, you will notice that I have this thing called please click here, and then you transition to a different activity. That is implemented by a listener there. Look for it in the code. Okay? Start paying attention to the code also there. Okay? It's important to, that's why I said, I explained theoretically what is done here. You also need to practice. That's the only way you will understand the whole concept. The lab exercises follow what I am explaining in the class. Okay? So, now for event listeners, depending on the event, some listeners return a Boolean value to indicate whether they have consumed the event or not. Why is this interesting? Why is this necessary? As you saw, with a button, for example, you can do both click as well as long click. Okay? Now, what happens with the Android framework is that if you touch a button and then lift your finger, if the Android framework thinks that it's a long click, it will call this long click method. Okay? Now, if it so happens that the long click method does not handle the event, it can return back saying, I did not handle the event. Let the OnClick one be called. So similarly, for example, on long click and on key, these are, and a couple of them in the next slide, all of them will return a Boolean value saying yes to indicate that they have consumed the event. Because if the Android framework realizes that the on long click did not consume the event, it will be forced to call the on click. Because an on long click could also be interpreted as an on click. Okay? So that's the reason why these ones will return a Boolean value S. Because if your Android framework realizes that these things did not respond, and then it needs to call the other framework. So that's the reason why. So on long click, for example, returns true to indicate that it has handled the event and it should stop here. It returns false if it has not handled the event, or the event should continue on to other on-click listeners. Yeah.
But under what circumstance would it return false if it hasn't handled it? Because it would always be called to return something.
Yes. But to indicate to the framework saying I am done, I am consumed, there may be certain situations where you may want to trigger a sequence of listeners. Now, under what circumstances? That depends. That depends upon your particular usage of handlers. Okay?
So
there may be a case where you may want to trigger a sequence of handlers, one behind the other.
So by default, what does it return?
So by default, it returns false. So you have to put a true in there. I believe it returns a false by default. We need to check the documentation. I think it returns a false. So that's why at the end you always put a return true to indicate that you have consumed. But there may be situations where you want to let it move on to the next one. That is, you want the system to call the OnClick also after that, because there may be something that the OnClick needs to be done. Now, this is specific to your application. So the provision is there for you to allow such a thing to happen. Okay? If you did not have that, then you would have no choice. You will leave it to the Android framework to determine what to do. But here, at least you have a choice to let it chain through to the next event. After OnClick will be called if the handling is not stopped. Same thing with OnKey also. Okay. Now, and same thing with OnTouch also. See again, touch, long click, and click have relationship. If you handle it with the touch, then you don't want the rest of them to be responding to the same event. Okay? So that's why but Android will give the priority in that order. So this event can have multiple actions that follow each other. So if you return false when the down action event is received, you indicate that you have not consumed the event and are also not interested in subsequent actions from this event. Okay? Thus, you will not be called for any other actions within the event, such as finger gesture or eventual up action event and so on. So for example, you may be touching the screen and then lifting your finger. Do you want it to be interpreted as a click or a touch? All this has to be encoded. Okay? So Android framework will call event handlers first and then the appropriate default handlers from the class definition next. So as such, returning true from these event listeners will stop the propagation of the event to other listeners. That's the point. You don't want it to proceed forward. And it will also block the callback default event handler in the view. If none of them handle, the default handler will be called in that particular case. That's why you have to stop the point. Okay? Event handlers are more specific to certain custom views. Event listeners are designed more for standard things that you use in the view. Now, in Android, you can create also your own special widgets. See, Android provides the standard buttons and things like that for you to use. But if you are not satisfied with those buttons, you can create your own button with your own graphic. But then that will require you to implement a custom handler for that. Okay? There may be situations where you want to create a nice user interface with nice, wonderful buttons on the screen. The existing buttons, you can customize them to a certain extent, but there may be situations where when you customize them, that may not be sufficient for you. In that case, you may implement your own version by using PNG files and so on. In that case, you will have to handle them using event handlers. Okay? Now, for custom view components, these are all the handlers that are available for you. These are the handlers that you can declare. On key down, on key up. So down and up are interpreted to different trackball event, touch event, focus changed event. Again, in the examples in the lab, you will see usage of some of these in practice. So you will get to understand them better when you see them in the examples. Okay? Let me stop at this point. And then we'll continue on Wednesday next week, further discussing this particular plan.